Here's something to ponder: voter ID laws. There has been a lot of talk about this, mostly in southern Republican run states, about voters and having IDs that they have to present, your government issued identification, which is usually a driver's license. And many people believe that you need to have a driver's license to vote. In theory, this makes a lot of sense. If you want to vote to prevent fraud, you should have to present your government issued identification. That makes sense. The problem is that, one, not everybody has a government issued ID, and so there are a lot of minorities and recent immigrants who would not be able to vote effectively if they had to present an identification. That's the first thing. Second thing, getting an ID costs money. I think that if people had to present an ID to vote, then the ID should have to be free, because that it would be regressive in the sense that wealthier people would be able to afford the ID, and people who are not so wealthy or who could spend the money putting food on the table or making their mortgage payment would not vote because they would not want to spend the money to buy an ID, which makes sense. Buy an ID so I can vote, or buy a piece of chicken so my children don't starve. That's a choice that a lot of people have to make. Don't forget, 1 in 7 Americans are on food stamps. 1 in 7. So if you walk around the street somewhere, if you picked out every 7th person, that person would be on food stamps. And so I guess I could support having an ID to prevent fraud, presenting an ID when you vote, as long as the IDs were free and easy to get. You should be able to get them more than at a motor vehicle, which there are a lot of them, but the motor vehicles are not close to my house. It's still a 25-minute drive from my house. But here's the other problem. The problem is that this issue has become too political. The Democrats are against voter ID laws, new voter ID laws, and this specifically IDs, because they say that less minorities will vote, and overwhelmingly minorities vote Democratic. So the less minorities who are able to vote, the less Democratic votes. Republicans are in favor of voter IDs because if less minorities vote, there'll be less people voting against Republican candidates. So it's a smart issue for Democrats to be against and a smart issue for Republicans to be for. But here's the problem. If either Democrats or Republicans were really concerned about voter fraud, they would focus where there actually is voter fraud. There are very few, if any, cases in the last couple of years where people in person went to a voting booth, pretended to be someone else, and voted as that person. Very, very few, if any. Maybe a handful. The real voter fraud goes on in absentee ballots. So if any party cared about real voter fraud, they'd focus on the absentee ballots. And because they're not, that's how you know this is a political issue. It has nothing to do with actually detecting and removing any fraud. Zero to do with detecting fraud. Because doesn't it make sense? If you wanted to attack fraud, you would attack where the actual fraud is happening. And that is not occurring today. Think about how easy it would be for me to commit voter fraud with an absentee ballot. My great-grandmother, when she was alive, was in a nursing home for about 7 years. She was a registered voter for maybe 60 years at that point. How easy would it have been for me to order an absentee ballot in her name, fill it out with the candidate that I wanted to vote for, put it in front of her face one day when she wasn't really paying attention, or, towards the end of her life, she had a little bit of dementia, so she might not have known what she was signing, signed it, or I could have forged her signature and then sent it in. It'd be a little hard for me to show up in person to the polls and say, hi, my name is so-and-so, my great-grandmother's name, who she's a female, and vote. It would have been really hard for me to do that. It would have taken a lot of convincing. But look how easy it would have been for me to order an absentee ballot in her name and vote. Obviously, I didn't, because that would be voter fraud. But look how easy it would have been. One last thing before I let you go. In New Jersey, we do not have to present a government ID when we vote. But what we have to do is you have to sign a piece of paper. There's this big book, and it has all the names of all the registered voters in it. And next to your name, there's a signature. When you registered to vote, you had to sign your application to register to vote, and they scanned that in. And that signature that you signed is printed in the book. So when you go to vote at the polls in person on election day, you sign, and they match the signatures to make sure they genuinely look the same. And so that's how we do it in New Jersey. And we don't have to present IDs, as I said. And is there fraud going on in New Jersey? I'd be willing to bet in absentee ballots there's a lot of fraud. But in person, well, I think that's yet to be proven. There's something to ponder.